Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in to this third talk, which is part of the symposium Facilitating Authenticity, Being Myself in Different and Challenging Contexts. So my name is William Ryan, and I'm going to be talking to you today about linguistic authenticity in coming out narratives and its relation to well-being. So let's get into it. So has anyone ever told you to just be yourself, right? This is a common platitude that we often hear and a piece of advice that's often given for improving our well-being. When we look within the authenticity literature, we build on work by Michael Curtis and others, and we define authenticity, which is really what people are talking about when they're talking about being yourself. We define this as being comprised of two essential components. The first is self-authorship, which refers to the extent to which one's actions are willingly enacted, owned, and self-endorsed, as opposed to feeling forced or imposed on the self. Then secondly, we have genuineness, and this refers to the extent to which a person is able to behave congruently with key aspects of themselves and openly express themselves in interpersonal interactions with others. And so while research does support the relation between authenticity and well-being in general, when it's measured at both the trait and state level, we know that it's not always that easy. I think that's part of why that platitude of just be yourself can feel so irksome, right? There are many other factors that constrain our ability to be ourselves and to act in line with our own values and identities. These might be social structures or norms or relationships that control or constrain us in ways that make it difficult to be ourselves or to be authentic. And this relates to the construct that you've heard a lot about from my collaborators in the other symposiums of autonomy support, is really being oppositional to that type of control or coercion. And so autonomy support being the support from others or from social contexts that facilitate you being able to behave in ways that do align with your own values and identities and goals. And so when others support that, it's much easier to enact those identities and goals, to experience oneself as authentic, as self-authored and genuine in those interpersonal interactions. And when that autonomy support is there, that then leads to greater well-being. And so, of course, also this implies that our authenticity can vary across social context and social relationships, depending on the extent to which those are supported in those contexts. And so the extent to which people experience autonomy support has key implications here. And so while it's not easy for any of us to be authentic all of the time as we come across situational and relational constraints, authenticity may be particularly difficult for members of stigmatized groups, right? If an individual holds an identity that is broadly socially valued and denigrated, right, we may encounter more contexts in which our autonomy, particularly for that identity, is not supported and makes it more difficult to behave in authentic, open ways, particularly relating to that identity. Yet while it's very difficult, research does suggest that it's still important to integrate these negative experiences that relate to one's identity and other contentious aspects of the self. Integration of both positive and negative experiences has been shown to be essential for the well-being effects that follow from authenticity. When we look at in our past work, when we look at authenticity within the context of LGBTQ identities specifically, we operationalize it in some particular ways that I want to explain here. And so we've assessed these key components of authenticity as ownership and outness. And when we talk about ownership, we're really thinking about how much the person is able to feel integrated around that identity, feel close and connected to that identity. And so the items that tend to assess the construct of ownership are things like, I feel in touch with my LGBTQ identity, I feel close and connected to this identity, and I can openly embrace it, right? And so this ownership or integration is essential for actions to be self-authored. You need to have that be part of the self in order to have that self-authorship occur. Then secondly, we have outness, right? And here this is referring to genuineness around the LGBTQ identity and being able to express that openly in interactions with others. And so the items that assess outness are assessing the extent to which other important people in relationships and social contexts know about one's sexual identity or orientation, and the extent to which one is able to openly talk about that with those others. And so it's not just about do they know, but are you able to openly talk about and express that identity? And when we've looked at this in our past work, when we've looked at ownership and outness as measures of self-authorship and genuineness, our past work has shown that autonomy support is indeed associated with greater ownership or integration of identity. This is particularly true for those from stigmatized and conflictual identities. And so although autonomy support facilitates authenticity across identities, whether they're contentious or stigmatized or not, this effect is greater for those who have identities that are difficult to integrate because of conflict and stigma around those identities. And again, we also in our past work show that it is when this autonomy support is present that that authenticity leads to the well-being benefits. So now I want to get into the present research, the study I want to discuss here. So what we're doing in this work is, again, looking within the context of LGBTQ identity and expression of that identity. And we want to examine the relation between different measures of authenticity. So ownership and outness, like we've looked at in the past, but adding a new one here of linguistic authenticity, which I'll explain more about in a moment. Looking at this, the impact on well-being, and doing so particularly within the context of people's past coming out experiences or experiences in which they've disclosed their sexual minority identity. So specifically here, we're interested in exploring how linguistic authenticity, which is the use of open and unfiltered language in retelling a story. We want to look at linguistic authenticity in people's narratives about their best, worst, as well as their most recent coming out experiences, and look at how this relates to the other indicators of authenticity, of outness and ownership, as well as to well-being, both in general and after telling each of these narratives, the best, worst, and the most recent. So for this study was conducted at the University of California in Santa Barbara when I was still there, and we recruited sexual and gender minority participants from the university there. And so this sample includes 63 LGBTQ identified participants who all received payment for participation in the study. And so here you can see the demographic breakdown of this relatively diverse sample. Because of the small total sample size, we're not able to break down analyses based on these different identities, but we were able to at least capture a broader range of experiences in this sample. So the procedure for this study is that first, prior to coming into the lab for the actual study and the retelling of the narratives, participants all filled out a pre-survey that measured the person-level variables that we were interested in this study. And so ownership of that LGBTQ identity, outness across social contexts. And so this is a measure of overall outness across all social relationships and contexts that the person is in, and their general overall well-being. And then we also asked some questions about how old they were when they first knew that they had a minority sexual identity, or when they first knew that they were not straight, and also how old they were when they first came out to others, how much time had passed since then. Then participants came into the lab, they did consent, and then in a counterbalanced order, they told 3 different stories about coming out experiences, times they had told others about their sexual identity or orientation, their best, worst, and their most recent. There was a 3-minute rest period between each of those retellings. And after each retelling, they filled out a survey about that particular experience, that best, worst, or recent experience. And the questions they answered about that were first, who was this person? Like, what was their relationship to this person that they were disclosing to? The time since this experience had occurred, how many times they had told it, how positive and negative this experience was, the amount of autonomy support they perceived experiencing from the person that they shared this identity with, and then their well-being immediately after telling this story. And after that was done, then they were debriefed, thanked, paid, and sent on their way. And so key to the results I want to present here was our use of LINQ, or Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count software, which was developed by Pennebaker and colleagues. And so this software can do a number of things, but I want to tell you about what we used it for here. So participants had come into the lab and told their stories. In order to be able to use the software, we first transcribed those narratives, and so got them into written words, and then fed those through the LINQ inquiry software, which again can do a number of things and outputs a variety of both dictionaries and summary measures. The dictionaries allow us to get counts of particular types of words used. But what we're really interested in here is a relatively new feature that LINQ has, which allows you to look at some variables that reflect the ways in which people talk. And here we're looking at linguistic authenticity. And what this reflects is the extent to which people are actively filtering versus not filtering what they're saying for an audience. And so authenticity, as measured here, is associated with less self-monitoring, more freely sharing that narrative. And so this is a composite measure. It's based on a validated algorithm that, again, detects this linguistic evidence of self-monitoring. Scores range from 0 to 100, and the lower scores tend to be found in texts that are heavily edited or narratives in which people are being either socially cautious or guarded, whereas high scores on authenticity tend to come up when people are not self-monitoring, not self-regulating what they're saying, and speaking more freely and spontaneously. And so that's the measure that we're going to look at here. So first, we just wanted to do a quick, essentially a manipulation check. Participants, right, again, told their best, worst, and most recent coming out experiences, and indeed the best ones were more positive and less negative than the worst ones. Recent tended to look a bit more like the best ones, which I think is good news. And so again, what we're just seeing here is that these worst experiences were indeed the worst. They were more negative and less positive. Accordingly, participants felt worse after telling their worst narratives. And so this is looking at their state well-being, so their well-being immediately following these narratives. And indeed, they felt significantly worse after telling their worst compared to the best and most recent. Turning then to autonomy support. Here we see significant differences between all three of the conditions, with autonomy support being lowest in the worst and highest in the best. And so all of this is consistent with our past work, suggesting that negative experiences are characterized by a lack of autonomy support, and this leads to negative well-being outcomes. So can again see this even more clearly when we look at the relation between autonomy support and state well-being in each of these narratives. In all three cases, right, there's a strong association between greater autonomy support and greater well-being after telling that narrative. And this emerges across all three narrative types, right? So even within the worst experiences, participants who experienced more autonomy support in those or less control experienced greater well-being after telling that narrative. Now to the more unexpected part. We found no differences in linguistic authenticity across the three conditions. In fact, linguistic authenticity across them was highly correlated within participants, right? So participants who were authentic in their way of telling one experience tended to be authentic in their way of telling the other ones as well. Despite that, we still wanted to look into some of the relations between linguistic authenticity and autonomy support and state well-being. And so autonomy support from each disclosure target was inconsistently and at best weakly associated with linguistic authenticity. And so while there was a marginal effect for autonomy support in the worst narrative relating to greater linguistic authenticity in that narrative, that effect again was small and marginal. Turning then to the relation between linguistic authenticity in each narrative and state well-being after that narrative, again, unexpectedly, we found no relation there, right? So speaking freely and authentically within in telling these narratives was not related to people's reported well-being after telling them. And so despite these null findings at the level of the narrative, we're still interested in the relation between this overall linguistic authenticity across narratives and the person level constructs of outness and ownership, as well as general well-being. And so given that participants' linguistic authenticity in the narratives were strongly correlated with one another, we averaged these three scores together to get an overall linguistic authenticity score. And so what we're looking at here is the relation between that overall score and, again, outness, ownership, and general well-being. And we see that overall linguistic authenticity is associated with greater outness and ownership, so the two other measures of authenticity, but was not associated with general or overall well-being. We then just wanted to examine whether linguistic authenticity in a particular narrative was driving this effect. And indeed, we did find this to be the case, that while this association emerged overall for linguistic authenticity, it seems that it's really the authenticity within this best narrative that is most strongly associated with outness and identity ownership. So this suggests that how participants express themselves when telling this most positive experience is most strongly associated with their overall outness and identity ownership. Lastly, we explored the relation between variables related to the timing of identity disclosure and the retelling of the narratives. And so I just want to highlight a few interesting relations that emerged here. So first, the age at which participants reported first knowing about their sexual orientation and knowing that it was not straight was not associated with any of the measures of authenticity. It was marginally and negatively associated with overall well-being, suggesting that people who knew about their sexual orientation earlier had lower well-being. But again, this is a small and marginal effect here. The time since first closing this orientation was associated with greater outness and identity ownership, but not with linguistic authenticity or well-being. And so this suggests that having more time since telling others was associated with probably coming out to more other people, so greater outness and a chance to process and gain greater ownership of this identity. But again, this was not reflected in the way that they told this narrative. Then looking at the number of times that they told each of these narratives, right? Maybe people tell their best one many times and their worst one very few, or vice versa, right? We're interested in, given that we know from past research that journaling and processing through storytelling can have well-being effects. We wanted to look at that here. And so what we see is that the number of times that people had told both their best and worst experiences were related to greater outness and identity ownership, particularly so for telling the worst one more times. Telling the best one more times was not associated with well-being, but telling the worst story more times in the past was associated with participants reporting greater overall well-being. So this is interesting given that participants felt worse immediately after telling their worst narratives, but having told those more times over time was associated with greater well-being overall. That suggests maybe that we are finding some effect of processing that's leading to greater ownership and well-being following that. These relations did not emerge for telling the recent one more times. This is likely because it was recent, and so there was less variation in how many times it had been told. but we do see a negative relation emerge for telling the recent one fewer times telling the recent one more times was associated with less linguistic authenticity. And so this suggests that there might be a rehearsal effect going on here, right? So that they've practiced this more, and so it shows less authenticity in this linguistic measure. So it's a lot of results here. So just to sum up what we found. First, participants felt worse after talking about their worst coming out experiences compared to their best and their most recent experiences. They also reported greater autonomy support from disclosure targets of their best experience relative to both their recent and worst experiences. And linguistic authenticity was not consistently related to autonomy support from the disclosure target or to well-being after telling each narrative, and unexpectedly so. And so rather, linguistic authenticity seems to vary more at the level of the person rather than the level of the narrative being disclosed. And indeed, averaging linguistic authenticity across narratives was associated with greater outness and ownership, but not general well-being. And this effect was driven largely by that linguistic authenticity in the best narratives. Again, although this was highly correlated with linguistic authenticity in the worst and recent narratives as well. Then also, right, turning to those time-related variables, even though participants reported their lowest well-being after telling their worst coming out experience, having told those worst experiences more times was associated with greater overall well-being, and this was not as strongly the case for best and recent experiences. And importantly, this association emerges even after we controlled for how long it had been since that experience, right? So it's not just that time had passed since that worst story, and that's why it was told more. Even controlling for how much time had passed, telling that worst story more times was associated with greater overall well-being. And then looking at the other measures of authenticity, telling the best and worst stories more times was related to greater outness and ownership, but this was not true for the recent. So what can we take from this? Well, first we need to note that, in the way that this study was designed and done, we can't disentangle the impact of that experience itself, the processing of it, and other factors that might have impacted linguistic authenticity in the retelling, right? So they're telling this back to an experimenter, and so there may be other variables that impacted, how comfortable and open people felt telling that story in that context that may or may not be related to how comfortable they were in that experience itself. And so future research should examine linguistic authenticity and concurrent coming out experiences as well, right? Because we can't know here. One possible explanation, right, is that even if someone is feeling authentic in that initial coming out experience, they may not feel authentic and open in that lab environment, or vice versa, right? That past experience could have felt very authentic, very inauthentic in that moment, but now is being relayed in an authentic manner. Future research should also examine more about the potential reasons for this lack of association between linguistic authenticity and well-being, examining potential moderators, including self-monitoring, experiences of discrimination, and internalized heterosexism. As past research suggests that these are factors that may also impact authenticity, both measured linguistically and in other manners. Still, the fact that we did see a relation between linguistic authenticity and the other authenticity-related variables of ownership and outness suggests that we may be assessing a distinct but related construct, given that there is some shared variance there. And that this still provides an interesting and potentially fruitful way to assess how open and guarded people are when discussing these key past experiences. And this does relate to these variables of outness and ownership. But importantly, right, integration of identity may involve the rehearsal of these narratives, right? The fact that people had told these more times was an important part of their relation to ownership, outness, and well-being. But when we look at how linguistic authenticity is calculated and what past research shows that it's associated with, rehearsal of things, telling it more times, can reduce linguistic authenticity scores. And so that may have sort of counted against us here in that way. So all that to say, there's a lot more to unpack here, and I would be excited to hear from anyone who has ideas for future directions, collaborations, or questions following up about this. And so to end, I just want to thank my wonderful colleagues and mentors, Nicole Legate and Netto Weinstein, and also one of my wonderful students, Chanel Fu, who has helped me with this project as well. I'd also like to thank all the members of my lab, the WISH Lab, for their support in this research. And if you have any questions or feedback, you can contact me at this email address here. So thank you so much.